Hey, good people. Welcome to chapter 10 of the semester where we are going to be exploring social work and social policies. I want to give you a reminder that at the end of this video lecture, please be mindful to complete any assignments and/or chapter quizzes that may be posted in this chapter's module. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, y'all know how to get in contact with me. All right, but we're going to go ahead and get started, good people, in talking about social policy. All right, and I ask that you please forgive me as my voice continues to heal, but I'm going to do my best to keep pressing through the recording of this lecture. So when we talk about social policy, one of the things we want to be, first of all, cognizant of is what is a social policy? So when we're talking about social policy, we're talking about being able to identify any of the inequalities that may hinder or impact our particular target population that we may be working with. And when we talk about social inequalities, we're not looking at just inequalities based on a cultural perspective, but looking at social institutions. And I need you to be mindful of this, good people. When we're talking about social institutions, I need you to think about what you're thinking about when we're considering social institutions. And we're going to get into that a little bit more in the chapter 10 when we begin to break down some of the legislation, and how that impacts specific target populations. But first and foremost, when we talk about social policy, we need to have an understanding that when we are reviewing social policy consists of a process as well as the products. And when we're talking about a process and the products, when we're looking at the process, we're talking about how the inequalities in our system, how they develop and create different hindrances for our target population. When we're talking about social policy as a process, we're looking at the formulation. We need to consider what exactly is the problem that needs to be addressed. And that's a big one, y'all. And I want you to think about some of the issues that you may have come to your attention or that you may be familiar with that you may have seen on social media or on mass media. An issue that is creating some type of dysfunction or that's affecting the way that we function socially or culturally. Now, we need to be mindful that when we're talking about a social problem, it could very well be an issue that was once personal for a particular person or a target population, but has begun to impact their interaction in society or them receiving equity and services, which creates this into a social problem. Now, when we're talking about the process of identifying the formation or the formulation of social policy, we also want to look at any existing policy that already exists. We want to look at the data behind the policy, the data that may affect creation of a new policy. We want to look at the implementation, of a possible new policy. Now, as we talk about social policy as a product, this is where we get into looking at the implementation of change. And I need you to kind of hold on to this, good people, because we don't go directly from, oh, this is a great idea, into change. There's a lot of steps or several steps that come into play when we're talking about implementing change, the product or the outcome of social policy. We need to make sure that we're looking at it from not just a legislative perspective, but also as we examine it in our agencies and organizations, looking at it from, again, not just legislative, but also looking at it from based on policies and procedures. So when we're talking about the implementation of change, this is where we have to ask ourselves, what are we hopeful for, or what are we anticipating? What are we anticipating the outcome to be? So I don't know if you recall, but in previous chapters, we talked about doing assessments, assessments based on our clients and consumers, their evaluation of the helping process, but also an assessment of ourselves, the worker, in the work that we've done throughout the helping process. It's the same thing here when we talk about social policy. We always want to make sure, excuse me, that we have an assessment in place that we are reviewing the work that needs to be done, again, that's going to implement change and kind of be that catalyst, I guess you could say, for addressing any any inequalities that may exist within the system. And now, when we talk about the system, good people, I need you to be mindful. We're not just referring to the overall system as a whole, like the social welfare system. But again, we need to break this down a little bit, and need to look at agencies and organizations that are providing services within the system. So then that's when we get to, when we're talking about the analysis, this is where we get into looking at how are we examining the policies that may be in place? How are we looking at and assessing um, the benefits, maybe the hindrances, maybe the need to update a policy or procedure. And when you read through chapter 10, you'll see it's going to go into a lot of great detail where it's talking about analyzing our policies and procedures, looking at specific actions or specifications, I guess you could say, about the services that are being provided, the feasibility. What does that mean, the feasibility? We're looking at the outcomes. Are we meeting the outcomes? Are we addressing the needs excuse me, that should be addressed? When we talk about the policy merits, we're looking at how effective is this policy that is currently in place. And when we're thinking about making changes, we have to look at what is the procedure, what is the process in making changes to an existing policy, practice, legislation. So when we're talking about changes from a legislative perspective, there's another little short video that I've included in this module that it's one, honestly, that it introduces the legislative process in a very simplistic way. It's one that, honestly, I recall watching when I was a child, and it's by Schoolhouse Rocks. And it's just talking about how a bill comes into a law. When we're talking about legislative action and making substantive changes, this is just, again, a little side note that kind of walks us through how we see change implemented. Now, when we're talking about change and we're talking about social policy, this is where our book kind of gets into breaking things down for us, introducing to us political ideologies. And now, when I say it's introducing it to us, I need you to understand something, that in the other courses that will follow, specifically social welfare, that's where we focus specifically on political ideologies throughout the entire semester, addressing specific social issues. So again, in this chapter, we're just being introduced to some ideologies. When we talk about ideologies, the thing that we want to be mindful of is that an ideology is just this. It is basically providing information, a perspective that is going to be kind of the foundation or the catalyst for us to adapt or to get our ideas about specific public issues or private issues. It is going to be one that is going to drive recommendations for solutions. When we're talking about ideologies, now I need you to understand something. It may not necessarily be according to your political affiliation. Excuse me, that determines the ideology that you follow 100%. Political affiliation and ideology, while they may seem similar, they are not going to be the same thing. The ideology is basically driving the idea behind what change you want to see happen. Now, yes, based on the ideology, it can impact my political affiliation, but we're not going to have that discussion here. And actually, good people, we don't have that discussion in social welfare because your political party is your political business, right? But for the purpose of the profession of social work, we have to have an understanding about the thought process behind the work that's being done, so that we as social workers, as we're advocating for change, we know what perspective it is that we need to address and in what way it would be best to address that perspective. So there's three ideologies that the book introduces us to. The first one is liberalism, then conservatism, then radicalism. So I'm going to go back and talk about our liberalism. Excuse me, when we talk about our liberal perspective is so much looking at that social welfare is it is a function of the government and client rights. When we're talking about our liberalism, we're looking at this from the perspective of, if I can introduce a little bit from the Elizabethan Poor Laws. The Elizabethan Poor Laws were the ones that, again, were focusing on how do we make things right for people? How do we see people as humans? And that's kind of the perspective that the liberalism or the liberal perspective takes, is that it champions human rights and equity and equality. Excuse me. So when we're thinking about the liberals, again, a lot of times that comes from the perspective of the Elizabethan Poor Laws. When we're talking about conservatism, conservatism is looking at this whole idea that it's not so much the government that needs to take on the responsibility of helping people, but this is the liberalism kind of looks at, I'm sorry, conservatism looks at the individual inadequacies. Okay, and it's looking at that individual inadequacies could be the cause of the problem. When we're talking about conservatism, there is also the idea that social welfare is not intended to, again, to be this catch-all that everybody kind of depends on. And that's where we get down into this neoconservatism, where they're saying like that we need to kind of overturn this liberal perspective of providing social welfare programs, and people need to kind of pull themselves up by their bootstraps. This conservative perspective, again, is looking at that the problems that people face are all the problems that people face are caused by their personal issues, and it should not be addressed by the government or by business, as the liberals kind of focus on. When we get to the radicalism, if I could speak, y'all, I'm sorry. Radicals are looking at this perspective of that it is an institutional issue, that it's institutional structures versus the individual. And radicalism is saying that when we think about the whole idea of providing services, that we need to provide services that are going to invoke change, social change. Like we don't need to provide services or provide resources that are going to keep folks kind of still pigeonholed in a place where they're comfortable. So like the radical perspective, they kind of all focus on, or they fight for things such as the feminist movement. Like you see a lot of radicals in that, but we see a lot of action being taken, advocacy action being taken for, we're fighting for change in legislation. When we talk about the conservatives, those that are looking at, you got to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, their perspective a lot kind of coincides with the charity organization society, this whole behavioristic perspective, meaning that we could change behavior if we just address behavior. That liberal perspective kind of takes on the work, or I should say, highlights the work of our pioneers in the settlement house movement, Jane Addams and Ellen Starr, where we're going into the communities to make a difference, where we're saying, okay, we need to make change happen, but we need to make change happen for the benefit of the people who are living in the communities. So be mindful. So those are our three perspectives that we're going to be looking at. And I need you to think about when you read into chapter 10 and you start looking at the history of legislation that has been in place. So again, we have the conservatives, we have the liberal, we have the radical. Now, as we're moving on and talking about social work and social policy, this is where we begin to kind of see the rubber meeting the road, where we talk about breaking things down, that we kind of make sense of it and looking at the type of work and the type of resources that are available for folks. Here in the book, this is where we begin talking about our street level bureaucracy, street level bureaucrats, and also our street level clients. Let me just go through so you can see that there a little bit. and the street level clients. When we talk about our street level organizations and bureaucracies, this is where we're looking at our service providers kind of being the ones that determine who's going to be eligible for which programs and which services. So we're looking at like public and private institutions. We're looking at court mandated or court order services that are given to folks. And again, we're looking at the organizations and the bureaucracy that is deciding who is entitled to receive these services. And I need you to be mindful of that, good people, because those types of organizations are functioning according to the policy and the procedures that have been established within that system. Okay, be mindful of that within that system. And I need you to think about this. When we talk about those that are working within that system, they are bound to follow the policy and the procedures that are highlighted or implemented in that system. And that's where we get to these street level bureaucrats. Again, these are folks who are following the rules and regulations, the policies and procedures that have been set before them, not questioning it. And I need you to be mindful and think about this, good people. What exactly is a bureaucracy? What is a bureaucrat? We know the bureaucracies were established in order to create efficiency in a system. It doesn't necessarily mean that it makes sense. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's providing equity and services, but it's supposed to be efficient. And so the folks that are working within these agencies and organizations, again, they are working based on the policies and procedures and the practices that have been established. So at this point, one of the bullets that I want you to be mindful of is this last one right here, is that they may reinforce the status quo. What does that mean to you? When you think about the status quo in social service agencies and organizations, that there is, excuse me, an expectation of the client consumer that's coming in and an expectation of the services that are going to be rendered and what the outcome is going to be. This is where we start to deal with the street level clients. And now I need you to think about this, good people. Excuse me. When we talk about the street level clients, this is where that bureaucracy kind of gets in the way sometimes of us meaning social workers, kind of making good sense and having constructive conversations and partnerships with our clients or consumers. And the reason why I say that is because this is where we begin to adapt or adopt that mindset of the label. That we label folks according to the policies and the procedures that have been laid out for us within our institution. And we begin to function with our clients and consumers according to that label that we give them. And I need you to think about this. We talked about this in other chapters when we think about the label that is giving, especially to a marginalized population. What does that label do? It begins to stigmatize or begins to create this prejudicial mindset, because we begin to stigmatize people based on the label that is assigned to them. And I want you to ask yourselves, how might this hinder the work that I do with my client, consumer, or patient? When you ask yourself that question, this is where we kind of get down to the perspective where we're looking at how does the work that I do as a social worker influence the system that I work in? And how might I take a look at things from a different perspective? And this is where we kind of break things down when we're talking about policy and procedures, when we're talking about legislation. We break it down to a micro level perspective as well as the macro level perspective. Now, when we're talking about it from a micro level perspective, this is where I need you all to think about some things where we're looking at how does it affect or how does it influence my client as a person, but also how does it influence the partnership and the work that I do with this client or consumer as a social worker. We look at it based on the type of services that we provide from an agency or an organization perspective, looking at our mission statement for our agency or organization, our value statement for an agency or organization. So from a micro level, we can look at it for our client or consumer, but also for our agency or organization. When we get to the macro level perspective, this is where, again, we begin to think about things from that ideological thought process of Who are we relying on, or who are we blaming, or who are we assigning blame to, or responsibility to, or accountability to for specific issues? We look at it from a cultural perspective, from a social perspective, looking at it from a legislative perspective. Also being mindful, good people, that everything that we do is also influenced from a global perspective. So all of these things kind of tie into place when we're talking about social work and social policy. Okay, so as you continue to read through chapter 10, good people, I want you to be mindful of this foundation in the very beginning of chapter 10, where it, again, it's telling us about looking at social policy, defining social policy, and also defining for us the three perspectives or the three ideologies that we're kind of introduced to when we're looking at the legislation that has been come about. Again, that's the conservatives, that's the liberals, that's the radicals. In the rest of chapter 10, what you're going to see is a historical perspective of legislation from the beginning up to current day. So you're going to see there is going to definitely be a table in the chapter that's going to lay out for you the history of social welfare legislation. We're going to be looking at social welfare from very beginning when we're looking at Federal Emergency Relief Act all the way up to current day. Excuse me, where we're looking at temporary assistance to needy families, the Obamacare Act, and all of the legislation in between. All right, so I want you to be mindful that when you're reading through chapter 10, think about, first of all, the ideology of the three, or I should say the three ideologies that we reviewed, and also consider the steps that are taken to make to see change happen, to implement change. And you'll be introduced to that legislatively by that little short clip that I'm going to include from Schoolhouse Rock. All right, good people. So this is just a brief overview of chapter 10, where we're being introduced to social work and social policy. Be mindful, good people, to please complete the assignment and/or chapter quiz that may be posted for you in this chapter module. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you know how to get in contact with me, either by email or you can call my office phone. In the meantime, I bid you love, peace, and bacon grease, and we'll catch you on the discussion post.